Right now, a major American city is running out of water. The reservoirs built to survive the worst drought in Texas history are more empty today than that drought ever left them. The official emergency deadline is calculated from a model that no longer matches the climate it was built for. There is a name for what is actually happening here. Scientists have known it for years. Almost no one is saying it out loud. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what that name is. Stay with me. The last time Texas faced a water crisis this serious, it lasted 7 years. The drought of record ran from 1949 through 1957, and it destroyed $22 billion worth of agriculture, livestock, and livelihoods in today's dollars. At least 1,000 Texas communities ran short. Some towns went completely dry and had to ship water in by rail just to keep people alive. Texas built Choke Canyon Reservoir and Lake Corpus Christi specifically to make sure that never happened again. As of June 3rd, 2026, they are emptier than that drought ever left them. Think about what it means to be a resident of Corpus Christi right now. You haven't been allowed to water your lawn since August of 2024. That's nearly 2 years of daily restriction. Every time you turn on a faucet, you're pulling from a system that's sitting at 8.3% of its designed capacity in its 2 primary western reservoirs. The city's own water authority has told you that a formal Level 1 water emergency could arrive by December 2026. What that emergency means, specifically, is that every household in the city would be required by law to cut water use to 6,000 gallons per month. The average American household uses about 9,000. You would be living at 2/3 of what every other American family considers normal. And this is the city that pumps crude oil exports through the nation's largest petroleum port, a port that generates $113 billion for the Texas economy and supports 864,000 jobs across the country. The water was supposed to be there. Subscribe to Rupture because on June 30th, 2026, NOAA releases the next drought outlook for the coastal bend, and that number will either move the emergency deadline closer or confirm it holds at December. We'll be tracking every shift as it happens. You will want to be here when it does. Hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss that update. Now let's get into it. Part 1. What is actually left? We're going to show you exactly what the real-time data says about Corpus Christi's water supply right now, reservoir by reservoir, number by number. Look at what that 8.3% figure actually means inside a household. It means the water you brush your teeth with comes from a reservoir that's missing 9 out of every 10 gallons it was designed to hold. It means the coffee you make tomorrow morning is brewed from a margin that the city itself describes as 180 days from formal emergency. It means the pipes feeding your kitchen tap are pulling against an empty lake bed where there used to be a fishery. That's not a forecast. That's now. That's tonight. That's the water sitting in the line behind your faucet handle as you watch this. And the people whose job it is to do something about it spent the early hours of June 2nd in a council chamber, arguing past 2 in the morning, and they didn't decide anything. They postponed the decision. Again, the reservoirs kept falling while they argued. Part 1. What is actually left? Here is a number that should not be possible. Choke Canyon Reservoir, the largest of Corpus Christi's 2 primary western water sources, is sitting at 8.3% of its designed capacity as of June 3, 2026, according to the Texas Water Development Board's live dashboard. That is not 8.3% of a small container. Choke Canyon's conservation capacity is 662,820 acre-feet of water. At 8.3%, it holds 54,196 acre-feet. The rest is empty lake bed, cracked mud, and exposed structures that haven't seen air since the 1950s. Pull up the Texas Water Development Board live reservoir dashboard right now. That's the agency that tracks every major reservoir in the state in near real time. The dashboard shows 2 numbers side by side for Corpus Christi's western system. The first is Choke Canyon at 8.3%. The second is Lake Corpus Christi, sitting at 24.2% of its conservation capacity. Lake Corpus Christi was built to hold 256,062 acre-feet. Today, it's holding 62,081. Add them together, and the combined western system is below 17% of total usable storage in the 2 reservoirs that legally trigger drought stages under the city's drought contingency plan. That 17% number is the one to hold in your head. It's the foundation of every other number in this video. Because the western reservoirs are the system the city's emergency plan was written around. They're the supply that determines when restrictions tighten. They're the supply that determines when a level 1 emergency gets declared, and they're collectively running on 1/6 of the water they were engineered to deliver. Now look at how they got there. The Nueces Basin is the watershed that feeds both western reservoirs. Every drop those reservoirs hold comes from rainfall that lands in that basin. The basin has been in continuous drought since late 2021. Year-to-date rainfall across the coastal Bend region has run at less than 60% of normal. This is not a single dry year. It's a 5-year accumulation of deficit that has pushed Choke Canyon from 47% capacity in October 2021 to 8.3% capacity today. That's a loss of nearly 40 percentage points of stored water in 4.5 years. Think about what that depletion curve looks like as a line on a graph. It does not bounce. It does not pause at a plateau and recover. It descends in a steady, repeating pattern of small partial recoveries followed by deeper drops. Each summer pulls more out than the previous winter could replace. Each spring rainfall event lifts the line briefly before evaporation, and demand take it lower than where it started. Ashley Ortiz works at a laundromat in Corpus Christi. She spends her days surrounded by machines that use water constantly. But at home, water has become something she monitors. She reminds her 3 sons not to let the faucet run while they brush their teeth. She checks how long the shower is going. She tracks what she buys at the grocery store by whether it needs to be washed. This is not a drought that shows up in a news alert and disappears. For Ashley, it shows up every morning before the kids go to school, and every evening when she turns off the kitchen tap and wonders how much longer it will hold. Multiply Ashley by 318,000. That's the population of Corpus Christi. That's the number of people running the same internal calculation every day. That's the human shape of a 17% combined storage figure. Now look at what the people in charge of the system have said about the timeline. On May 19, 2026, the Chief Operating Officer of Corpus Christi Water, Nicholas Winkelman, issued an official city press release. The exact language was this: the projected date for a Level 1 water emergency has been revised from September 2026 to December 2026. He stated directly that the revision reflects improved water supply conditions. The Level 1 water emergency is the formal threshold defined in the city's drought contingency plan as the moment when the city is 180 days from total supply failing to meet demand. Read that sentence again. 180 days from total supply failing to meet demand. That's the operational definition of Level 1. It's not a warning, it's a countdown. December 2026 isn't the date the water runs out. It's the date the city's own engineers calculated that they would be 6 months from running out, under the assumptions the model is using. The September date moved to December because of rainfall in May. That rainfall lifted reservoir levels by a measurable amount. It bought the system roughly 90 days. The emergency itself has not been avoided, it has been pushed back. The phrase improved water supply conditions does a lot of work in that press release. It's the kind of phrase that sounds reassuring on a city website, but pull it apart and what it actually says is this: the decline rate has slowed temporarily because of a discrete rainfall event, not because the underlying trend has reversed, not because the basin has returned to normal precipitation, because 1 month of rain interrupted the curve. That's what improved means in this context. The tension spike sits exactly here. The December date is built on a rainfall event in May that has already stopped, and NOAA's most recent forecast for the coastal bend says this summer will be hot and dry. The single thing that bought the city 3 months of margin was a 30-day weather pattern that the next 90 days are projected to undo. In plain language, what these numbers mean is this: the city has enough water to function right now, but the margin is thin and it is being actively managed. 65% of Corpus Christi's current water comes from eastern sources. Specifically, that's Lake Texana and the Colorado River, delivered through the Mary Roads pipeline system. Those eastern sources are carrying the city while the western reservoirs slowly lose what they have left. Lake Texana is currently near full, but its levels have been declining since mid-2025. The eastern system is the only reason December is still the projected date and not September. Pull that eastern support out from under the math, and the September date doesn't just come back, it moves forward. There's a specific trigger built into the eastern supply that matters. Lake Texana is operated by the Lavaca Navidad River Authority. The authority has a contractual threshold. If Lake Texana drops below 40% of capacity, the authority is required to implement a 20% curtailment of deliveries to Corpus Christi. That curtailment isn't a recommendation. It's a contractual obligation written into the water supply agreement. What that means in practice is this. The city's eastern lifeline has its own breaking point, and that breaking point is not currently being tracked in public statements about December. The official December date assumes Lake Texana continues to deliver at current rates. If the lake falls past 40% before December, the whole timeline collapses inward. The baseline for comparison is not a typical dry spell. Corpus Christi Water revised the drought contingency plan in 2025. The revision introduced the Level 1 designation specifically because the previous Stage 4 classification, which it replaced, was no longer adequate for the severity of what the system was experiencing. Read that sentence carefully. The city moved the goalposts upward because the conditions exceeded the old framework, which means the framework itself was already inadequate before the revision happened. That's not reassurance. That's a city adjusting its definitions to match a crisis that outgrew the previous ones. Stage 4 used to be the worst classification the city's plan recognised. It mandated maximum restrictions on outdoor water use, prohibitions on most non-essential water consumption, and emergency coordination protocols with state agencies. Stage 4 was supposed to be enough. By 2025 it wasn't, so the city added Level 1 above it, with even tighter restrictions and a formal countdown structure. This is the pattern you should be watching for. When a planning framework starts adding tiers above what was previously labelled worst case, the framework itself is telling you that the worst case has shifted. The 8.3% reading at Choke Canyon is not a number the previous plan ever expected to see. It's a number that required the plan to be rewritten. That rewrite happened quietly. There was no national news cycle about Corpus Christi changing its drought tiering. It was a routine municipal update, the kind that passes through City Council with a unanimous vote and a few paragraphs in a local paper. But the meaning of that update is the same as the meaning of the 8.3% reading. The system the city was operating under had been exceeded by reality. So here is the full picture for Part 1. The western reservoirs sit at a combined 17% of usable storage. The eastern sources are carrying 65% of the daily load and have their own 40% trigger that nobody is talking about publicly. The official emergency is projected for December, but rests on a single month of May rainfall that the summer forecast is expected to reverse. And the plan that calculates all of those dates was rewritten in 2025, specifically because the prior plan couldn't describe what was happening. Go back to Choke Canyon for a moment and stand at its edge. The shoreline as it exists today is not where any map shows it. The official lake boundary, the one printed on Texas parks and wildlife signage, sits hundreds of yards out beyond where the water actually meets the dirt. Boat ramps end in dust. Marina pilings stand on dry ground, still anchored to footings designed for 10 feet of water above them. There are structures emerging from the lake bed that have not been visible since the reservoir was filled in 1982. Fence lines, building foundations, the remains of a ranch road that was buried when the dam closed. They're back because the water is gone. Now layer that physical picture onto the dashboard reading. The 8.3% number isn't an abstraction. It's a coastline that has receded so far that the geography of the reservoir is no longer what it was designed to be. The water that's left is concentrated near the dam structure. Withdrawal points that were engineered to pull from the centre of the reservoir are now operating near the floor of the remaining pool. The closer the water gets to those structures, the more the intake systems have to work and the more the city has to manage the chemistry of what it's pumping. Sediment concentration rises, mineral content rises, treatment costs rise. Lake Corpus Christi tells the same story in a different shape. The 24.2% reading sounds higher than Choke Canyon's 8.3%. It is. But Lake Corpus Christi's design was different. It was built smaller and shallower as the buffer reservoir, meant to capture overflow from Choke Canyon during wet years and provide an additional buffer during dry years. When both reservoirs in a paired system drop simultaneously, the smaller one isn't a backup. It's a parallel failure. Year-to-date precipitation in the coastal bend is the underlying driver. NOAA's Regional Climate Division reports 60% of normal across the contributing watershed. That's an aggregate figure. Some subbasins have run drier than that. Some have caught a single intense rainfall event and reported closer to normal. The variability matters because reservoir refill depends on where the rain falls, A heavy storm over downtown Corpus Christi does almost nothing for Choke Canyon. The watershed sits to the northwest. Rain has to fall on the right ground, in the right amount, with the right runoff characteristics to translate into reservoir gain. The May rainfall did, briefly, exactly that. The summer forecast does not. And the system that calculates all of this, including the December date the city has publicly endorsed, is the system Part 2 is about to put under serious pressure. There's a specific phrase that appears in the drought contingency plan that's worth pulling out and looking at directly. The phrase is supply failure trigger. It's the technical name for the point at which calculated demand exceeds calculated remaining supply over the planning horizon. The Level 1 emergency is defined as the point at which the system is 180 days from that trigger, which means the December 2026 date the city has publicised is not the date water runs out. It is the date the city formally declares itself to be 180 days from water running out under current depletion assumptions. The actual 0 point, under the city's own math, would be approximately June 2027. Hold that timeline in your head for the rest of this video, because every piece of mitigation infrastructure discussed in Part 2, every research finding cited in Parts 3 and 4, every historical comparison drawn in Part 5, every economic consequence traced in Part 6, all of it has to be measured against the June 2027 supply failure date, not against the December 2026 emergency declaration. December is when the city formally enters the countdown. June is when the math actually exhausts. Look at the depletion math one more time, because the numbers compound in a way that's easy to miss. Choke Canyon lost 38.7 percentage points of capacity in 54 months. That's an average decline of 0.72 percentage points per month, sustained across 4.5 years. If that average held forward, Choke Canyon would zero out in approximately 11 months from June 2026, which is May 2027, which is 1 month before the system's actual supply failure date under the city's own internal math. Those two numbers, derived from completely different methodologies, arrive at almost the same answer. That convergence is what the city's planning team is staring at when they project December as the Level 1 declaration date. The convergence is also why the conversation about desalination matters so much, and why the June 2 vote matters so much, and why the question of whether the planning framework itself is built on the right assumptions matters most of all. Each of those questions sits inside the same 11-month window. The decisions made in June 2026 are operating on a clock that ends in May, or June of 2027. Anything that takes longer than that to build does not solve the problem the math is describing. It addresses the problem the math is describing in 2028, but the reservoir numbers are only part of what happened last week in Corpus Christi. On June 2nd, the city's own leaders were handed a direct decision about whether to act, and they chose something else. What they voted for, and what it actually does to that December timeline, is what Part 2 is going to show you. Part 2. What the city voted. Part 1 showed you the water levels. What Part 1 didn't show you is that while those levels were sitting at 8.3%, the people responsible for fixing the problem met on June 6th, 2026, and voted to do nothing. Not to approve a solution, not to reject one, to delay a decision they had already delayed 9 months before. A city that is 180 days from a water emergency voted to postpone the one infrastructure project that could have changed the math, and the vote came down on a closely divided council at 2:22 in the morning. The 2:22 in the morning detail matters. It's not a small thing that the vote happened at that hour. A municipal vote on a billion-dollar infrastructure decision rarely runs that late. It runs that late when the room cannot agree, when public testimony stretches for hours, when council members keep returning to the same disagreements, and when nobody wants to be the deciding vote. The Texas Tribune reported the meeting in detail. Public comment alone consumed hours. Water engineers spoke, residents spoke, industry representatives spoke, and after all of that, the council voted to postpone. Look at what the postponement specifically was. The proposal on the table was the revival of a desalination plant project that had been considered, debated and rejected by the same council 9 months earlier. The original rejection happened in late 2025 over concerns about cost, environmental impact on Corpus Christi Bay, and questions about whether the plant's permitting timeline was realistic. Those concerns weren't dismissed by the project's return. They were the same concerns. What changed was the urgency of the underlying water situation. The reservoirs had continued to fall. Pull up the official agenda from that June 2nd meeting. the desalination item was listed for action. Action means a vote, in either direction, that resolves the question. What the council did instead was vote to move the item back to a future agenda for further study. That procedural vote is the postponement. It doesn't reject the project. It doesn't approve it. It puts the question back into the queue, behind whatever else is added to the queue between now and the next scheduled review. The previous rejection, in late 2025, was a clean no. The June 2nd vote was not even a no. It was a refusal to decide on a closely divided council after hours of testimony at 2:22 in the morning. What the delay specifically cost the city is measurable. The desalination plant, if approved, would not produce water immediately. Construction timelines for facilities of this scale run 2 to 4 years minimum under favourable conditions. Add another year for permitting. Add another year for design finalisation and contractor procurement. Realistically, a desalination plant approved in June 2026 would not deliver a single gallon of treated water until 2029 or 2030. That timeline is the one to anchor against. The Level 1 water emergency is projected for December 2026. The actual supply failure date, under the city's own math, lands around June 2027, which means even an immediate approval of the desalination plant on June 2nd, 2026 would not have produced a single gallon of water before the emergency arrived. The desalination plant was never going to save December, but it could have begun closing the gap for 2027 and beyond. The delay pushes that gap wider. Bob Paulison is the executive director of the Coastal Bend Industry Association. He represents the businesses and employers that depend on Corpus Christi's water supply staying operational. In a recorded statement, he said something that has become a dark joke around the city. "We're praying to get hit by a head-on direct hurricane," he told a reporter. He meant it. A direct hurricane strike would dump enough rainfall on the Nueces Basin to refill the reservoirs in a single event. That is where this community is. The solution they are hoping for is a hurricane making landfall directly on their city. That is what the failure of every other option looks like from the inside. Read that sentence one more time. The business community in Corpus Christi is openly hoping for a direct hurricane strike because every other option has run out of road. A hurricane making landfall on a coastal city is one of the worst possible outcomes for life, property and economy. The industries Paulison represents understand this clearly. They're still praying for it. That is the operational reality the city is sitting inside. Corpus Christi is not the first American city to stall on desalination at the worst possible moment. The precedent that matters most here is the California drought of 2012 through 2017. During those years, the Carlsbad desalination plant north of San Diego sat in some stage of debate, permitting or construction for 17 years before it finally opened in 2015. 17 years. That number is the precedent every water engineer in Corpus Christi is currently citing in private conversations. Look at what happened during those 17 years. California's water situation deepened continuously. Reservoir levels dropped. Mandatory restrictions tightened across the state. Agricultural losses ran into the billions. When the Carlsbad plant finally opened, it was no longer a precautionary measure. It was emergency infrastructure that had been approved as precautionary and delivered as emergency. The plant now produces roughly 50 million gallons of fresh water per day for San Diego County. It is widely regarded as essential. It also took 17 years to build. The mid-part tension spike sits exactly here. California debated Carlsbad for 17 years. Corpus Christi doesn't have 17 years. Based on current depletion rates, it may not have 17 months. The risk profile shifts when the decision-making body cannot agree. A divided council signals that the political will to fund emergency infrastructure does not yet match the urgency the technical data demands. Water engineers cited in Texas Tribune reporting used the phrase, "a large city in a first-world country running out of water," not as hyperbole, but as a description of the operational trajectory. When engineers are talking about an American city this way, and the governing body cannot reach a decision, the gap between the technical reality and the political response is itself a risk factor. Read what Kenneth Dees said one more time. Dees is a water resources engineer based in Fort Worth, not an activist, not a politician. He told the Texas Tribune the city was running out of water. He said it the way a structural engineer talks about a building that won't stand much longer. That tone is the warning. Engineers do not use that language while there are still standard options on the table. They use it when the options have been catalogued, and the remaining ones don't add up to the requirement. The city's official position remains that a Level 1 emergency is projected for December 2026, and that several mitigation projects are underway. The mitigation list includes groundwater well expansion, effluent reuse infrastructure, and coordination with Lake Texana sources. What city officials have not said publicly is whether those projects together are sufficient to hold the December date if summer rainfall falls short of the May relief that pushed the date back from September. The gap between what the city is saying and what the data supports is the thing this video keeps returning to. Look at the groundwater piece specifically. The groundwater well expansion involves drilling additional wells into the Evangeline and Jasper aquifers, both of which sit beneath the coastal bend. Those aquifers can supply water. They can also be overpumped, and overpumping causes land subsidence, which is the sinking of the surface as the underground water table is drawn down. South Texas has seen subsidence-related infrastructure damage in the past. The groundwater option is not a clean solution. It's a trade between one supply problem and a different kind of long-term cost. The effluent reuse piece is similar. Effluent reuse means treating wastewater to a quality that allows it to be reintroduced into the water supply for industrial, or, in some cases, potable use. It is technically feasible. It is also politically sensitive, because the phrase that gets attached to it in headlines is toilet to tap, and that phrase has historically generated public opposition strong enough to delay or kill projects. Effluent reuse in Corpus Christi is in early stage planning. The infrastructure to support it at the scale the city would need is not yet built. Coordination with Lake Texana is the third leg of the mitigation strategy, but Part 1 already showed you that Lake Texana has its own 40% threshold and that the lake has been declining since mid-2025. Coordination with a supply that is itself trending downward is not a stable backstop. It's a managed transfer of risk from one falling source to another. Add the three mitigations together, and what you have is not a solution. It is a portfolio of partial measures, each with its own ceiling, none of which alone produces enough water to replace the western reservoirs at full operation. The city's public statements do not frame the mitigations this way. The data does. The June 2nd vote, the desalination delay, the divided council, the Carlsbad precedent, the engineer's language, the partial mitigations. Each of these is one element. Together they describe a city that knows what it needs to do, has not built the political agreement to do it, and is running on a clock that doesn't pause while the agreement is being negotiated. There's one more piece of the June 2nd vote that doesn't appear in most coverage. The council members who voted to postpone did not all vote for the same reasons. Some wanted more cost analysis, some wanted alternative project designs, some wanted public referendum input, some wanted to wait for state or federal funding announcements that might reduce the city's local financial exposure. Each of those is a defensible position in isolation. The problem is that postponement doesn't resolve any of them. It defers them, and the underlying clock keeps running while the deferrals accumulate. What is happening on a closely divided municipal council is the same thing that happened in California in 2002, in Phoenix in 2007, in San Antonio in earlier crisis cycles. A governing body confronted with a problem whose timeline is shorter than its political calendar will, more often than not, defer. Deferral feels safer. It preserves optionality. It allows the next election to inform the next decision. It also lets the underlying problem grow. For Corpus Christi, the deferral has a particular cost shape. Every month the desalination decision is postponed adds approximately a month to the eventual delivery date. That month doesn't come back. If the eventual delivery date moves from 2029 to 2030, the city's bridge from the December 2026 emergency to operational alternative supply gets a month longer. The bridge is built out of the mitigations described above and out of weather that nobody can guarantee. But the vote on June 2nd and the empty reservoirs and the approaching deadline are all happening inside a planning system that was built for a world that no longer exists. Part 3 is going to show you what that planning system actually assumed, and why the number the city is giving you for December may be the most misleading fact in this entire story. Part 3. What the plan assumed. Part 2 ended with the City Council's vote and the question of whether December is real. Part 3 answers that question, and the answer is technical, specific, and more alarming than anything in Parts 1 or 2. The official December 2026 timeline is not calculated from current climate data. It is calculated from a model that uses a drought that ended in 1957 as its worst-case reference point. Texas built an entire state water planning system around the 1950s drought because that was the worst thing Texas had ever measured. The problem is that the worst thing Texas ever measured is no longer the worst thing Texas is experiencing. Pull the Texas State Water Plan. That's the official document published by the Texas Water Development Board every 5 years. It governs every infrastructure investment, every emergency threshold, and every planning decision related to water in Texas. The plan is hundreds of pages. The methodology section, the part most people never read, contains the single most important sentence in this story. The plan's drought planning benchmark is the 1950s drought of record. That phrase, drought of record, is a technical term. It means the worst drought in the instrumental data, the period against which all supply and demand projections are calibrated. The drought of record ran from 1949 through 1957. It's the 7-year drought you heard about in the hook. The plan uses it as the ceiling. The plan assumes that the worst future drought will not exceed the 1950s drought, and it sizes reservoirs, infrastructure investments, and emergency timelines accordingly. The December 2026 emergency date for Corpus Christi flows from this assumption. The model behind the date assumes that what the system is currently experiencing cannot get worse than what the system experienced from 1949 to 1957. The problem is that the system is already experiencing worse. Choke Canyon at 8.3% today is lower than Choke Canyon ever fell during the 1950s. Lake Corpus Christi at 24.2% today is at or near its 1950s low, depending on which monthly reading you compare. The benchmark has been exceeded. The model it generated December 2026 has been operating outside its calibrated range for months. Look at what current science says about the future. The Texas Water Research Network, operating through the Office of the Texas State Climatologist, published a study in a peer-reviewed scientific journal documenting that climate models project drier summer soil moisture and decreasing reservoir supplies for both eastern and western Texas throughout the 21st century. The study found that conditions in the latter half of this century are forecast to be drier than any megadrought recorded in the last 1,000 years. That includes the medieval droughts that archaeologists have linked to the collapse of ancient southwestern civilizations. The Texas State Water Plan does not incorporate this research. It still uses 1957 as the ceiling. Read those two sentences together. The Texas State Climatologist's Office, working with peer-reviewed researchers, has produced findings that say the second half of this century will be drier than any of the past 1,000 years. The state's official water plan, which governs the infrastructure for that same second half of the century, uses 1957 as the worst case. There's a gap between those two documents. The gap is the size of the problem. Drive out to Lake Corpus Christi today, and you will find boat ramps jutting from cracked, sun-baked earth like fence posts in a field. The waterline has pulled back so far that what was once lakefront is now scrubland. Nathan Payne, the executive director of Camp Zephyr, a Christian retreat that has sat on the lake since 1957, has watched the water retreat year by year. He has watched 1930s structures emerge from the lake bed that haven't been above the waterline since before his organisation existed. "We've been here since '57, he said, just shortly after they dammed the river. He has now watched the lake fall lower than it was the year his camp was founded. The dam was built to prevent exactly this. Now connect this back to what parts 1 and 2 showed. Choke Canyon at 8.3% today is exactly the condition the 1950s drought never produced. Read that again. The 1950s drought, which is the planning benchmark, never pushed those reservoirs below the level they are at right now. This is not the researchers speculating about future conditions. This is happening now, in June 2026, and it has already exceeded the worst case that the entire Texas planning system was designed to handle. The infrastructure built to survive the 1950s drought is failing under conditions the 1950s drought did not produce. Every official number flowing from that system, including December 2026, is calculated against a reference point that has already been surpassed. There's a specific technical reason the benchmark matters. Texas engineers calculate reservoir sizing using a metric called firm yield, which is the maximum amount of water a reservoir can reliably deliver during the worst drought in the planning record. When engineers sized Choke Canyon and Lake Corpus Christi in the 1970s and 1980s, they calculated firm yield against the 1950s drought. They built the reservoirs with enough storage to deliver Corpus Christi's contracted water demand even if a drought of 1950s severity returned. That math was sound at the time. The 1950s drought was the worst available data point. The math is no longer sound. If a drought worse than the 1950s drought arrives, firm yield as calculated does not deliver Corpus Christi's contracted demand. The reservoir runs lower than the engineers planned for. The supply margin compresses. The Level 1 emergency triggers earlier than the model projects. This is exactly the situation the city is in right now. The firm yield calculation that underpins the December 2026 date was built against a drought that the current conditions have now exceeded. The danger of using an outdated benchmark is not just that projections may be optimistic. The danger is that the entire decision-making chain, from the City Council's vote on desalination to the state's water investment timeline to the federal infrastructure funding applications, runs through the same outdated model. Every actor in this story is working from the same floor plan, and the building has already sunk below it. That's the mid-part tension spike, and it deserves a sentence by itself. The entire decision chain, from the City Council to the state legislature to the federal funding desk, is running on the same floor plan, and the building has already sunk below it. The water was supposed to be there. The engineer said so, the state said so, the plan said so. Each of those three sentences carries a different weight. The engineer said so means the people who built Choke Canyon and Lake Corpus Christi in the 1970s and 1980s did the math correctly for the data they had. The state said so means the Texas Water Development Board, in its official planning documents, certified the firm yield numbers as sufficient. The plan said so means the state water plan, updated every 5 years through 2022 and again through 2027, continued to certify those numbers as the foundation of municipal water supply across South Texas. Now ask yourself how a planning system can certify numbers that the reservoirs themselves are visibly contradicting. The answer is that the planning system is not designed to update against current conditions in real time. It's designed to update on a 5-year cycle against historical data using a methodology written into state code. The 1950s benchmark is in the methodology. Changing the benchmark requires changing the methodology. Changing the methodology requires legislative action. Legislative action moves on a different clock than reservoirs. There's a phrase from climate adaptation research that fits exactly here. The phrase is stationarity assumption, meaning the statistics of the past are a reliable guide to the statistics of the future. Climate planning has historically assumed stationarity. Climate science has, for at least the last decade, said stationarity no longer applies. The Texas State Water Plan still assumes it. Every number that flows from that plan inherits that assumption. What the science cannot yet answer is the precise rate at which the gap between the 1950s benchmark and the actual climate trajectory is widening. Researchers can project directional trends with high confidence. They cannot give a city a precise date on which the 1950s model becomes so inadequate that the December 2026 estimate should be moved to October or September. That uncertainty is itself the problem. The system does not fail cleanly. It fails in the space between what the model says and what the ground shows. Hold that uncertainty carefully. It does not mean the model is wrong by a factor of 2, or that December is actually August. It means the model is wrong by an amount that can only be known after the fact, in retrospective analysis, after the system has either held or failed. That's the operational meaning of a benchmark that has been exceeded. You cannot calculate the error precisely while you're inside it. Consider what this means for federal funding applications. When Corpus Christi applies to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or to the Bureau of Reclamation for Emergency Water Infrastructure Funding, the applications cite the State Water Plan as the underlying planning document. The federal agencies review the applications against the projections in that plan. If the plan understates the urgency, the federal review timeline doesn't reflect the true urgency. Funding moves at the pace the plan suggests, not at the pace the reservoirs require. This is how an outdated benchmark propagates upward through a multi-level governance system. The city uses the state's number. The state uses the historical benchmark. The federal review uses the city's filing, which used the state's number, which used the benchmark. Nobody in the chain is calculating from current climate data. Everybody is calculating from the same antique foundation. There's one more layer. Insurance and bond rating agencies also factor water supply security into municipal credit ratings. Those ratings use the same publicly available planning documents. If the documents understate the risk, the ratings understate the risk. Bonds get issued at lower interest rates than the true risk would justify. Capital flows into infrastructure projects whose underlying water supply assumptions are weaker than the documents indicate. The financial system absorbs the same outdated assumption that the planning system began with. What you're looking at is not a single agency making a single mistake. You're looking at an entire stack of institutions, from local government through state planning, through federal review, through financial markets, all calibrated to a worst case that has already been exceeded. The 8.3% reading at Choke Canyon is the visible artifact of that calibration failure. The reservoir is showing you, in real water, what the documents have not yet acknowledged. The water was supposed to be there. The engineer said so. The state said so. The plan said so. And the reservoir, sitting at 8.3% on June 3, 2026, is saying something different. Look closely at how the 1950s drought of record was instrumented. The measurement systems that captured it in real time were sparse. Rain gauges existed but were unevenly distributed. Reservoir level monitoring was manual. Soil moisture data, the kind that climate scientists now consider essential, was not collected systematically across Texas until decades later. The drought of record is a benchmark assembled from the data that existed at the time. It is the worst drought we measured. It is not necessarily the worst drought that occurred in the geological or paleoclimatic record of Texas. Treering research has, in fact, identified droughts in the Texas paleoclimatic record that lasted longer and produced deeper precipitation deficits than the 1950s event. The medieval period, roughly 900 to 1300 of the Common Era, contains evidence of megadroughts across the American Southwest that ran for decades. Those droughts coincided with the collapse and migration of pre-Columbian civilizations across the region. They are not in the instrumental record because no instruments existed. They are in the treering record because trees grew through them and recorded the dry years in their growth patterns. The relevance is direct. The Texas State Water Plan uses the worst drought we measured as the ceiling. Paleoclimatic data tells us that worse droughts than that have happened in this region, and that the conditions producing them are within the range of climate variability the region can experience. The plan's ceiling is not a physical limit, it's a measurement-limited assumption. Climate models that incorporate paleoclimatic data project that the second half of this century will produce droughts at or beyond the medieval scale. That projection is what the Texas Water Research Network study published in Earth's Future documents. The Office of the Texas State Climatologist has signed off on that finding. It is not a fringe position. It is the central projection of peer-reviewed regional climate research. And yet, the Texas State Water Plan still uses 1957 as its ceiling. The methodology has not been updated. The reservoirs are sized to a drought benchmark that science now considers a substantial underestimate of plausible future conditions. There's a practical consequence to all of this that residents of Corpus Christi don't see in their water bills. The consequence is that every dollar the state has spent on water infrastructure in Texas since the 1957 establishment of the Texas Water Development Board has been calibrated against the same drought benchmark. Engineers sized the 126 major reservoirs built across the state by 1980 to that benchmark. The pipelines connecting them were built to the same standard. The treatment plants drawing from them were designed to match it. The entire physical hydrology of municipal Texas, from El Paso to Houston to Corpus Christi, sits on a foundation that the science now describes as insufficient. Replacing that infrastructure is not a city-level project. It is a multi-generational, multi-billion-dollar undertaking that the state has not begun to scope. But here is what parts 1, 2, and 3 have not yet told you. The reason the 1950s benchmark no longer works is not because the drought got worse. It's because the drought isn't a drought anymore. There is a name for what is actually happening to the water supply of South Texas, and Part 4 is where that name finally gets spoken. Part 4. What cannot be undone. Part 3 ended with a question about what changed. The 1950s benchmark stopped working not because the drought got worse, but because what's happening now is not a drought in the scientific sense of that word. A drought is temporary. Rain ends a drought. What parts 1, 2, and 3 have been describing is something different, something with a longer arc and a harder ceiling. The mechanism driving all of this has a name. It has been in the peer-reviewed scientific literature since at least 2020. It was the subject of a NOAA research seminar as recently as April 13, 2026. Almost no one outside the forecasting community is saying it in public. We are going to say it now. The mechanism driving this is called anthropogenic aridification. Aridification means a region is transitioning permanently to a drier baseline, not cycling through a drought that will eventually end. Anthropogenic means it is being driven by human-caused warming, which means the cause is not going to stop, and the direction of the shift is not going to reverse. This is why Choke Canyon sits at 8.3%, even though the Nueces Basin has received occasional rainfall. This is why the May rain pushed the emergency date from September to December, but did not meaningfully refill the reservoirs. This is why the City Council's desalination delay and the state's 1950s benchmark both contain the same fatal assumption. The assumption is that the water will return to the levels the infrastructure was designed for. Anthropogenic aridification says it will not. As of April 13, 2026, NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System hosted a dedicated scientific seminar titled Pathways of Ongoing Aridification in Southwest North America. The seminar was presented by Richard Seeger of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, examining the ocean, atmosphere and land mechanisms of aridification extending into the southern plains and South Texas. This is not a fringe argument. This is NOAA's own researchers presenting the mechanism to other scientists and forecasters. That is what this is. Now you know what you are looking at. Everything before this moment was the setup. This is the answer. The scientific foundation is a 2020 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Jonathan Overpeck and Bradley Udall, titled Climate Change and the Aridification of North America. Their finding is direct. The American Southwest and expanding adjacent regions are not experiencing cyclical drought. They are undergoing a permanent directional shift toward lower baseline soil moisture, reduced river flows, and diminished reservoir inflows. Not a bad decade. A structural transition that accelerates with each additional degree of warming. Cyclical drought ends. Aridification does not. That distinction is the difference between a problem Corpus Christi can plan its way out of and a problem the city has to adapt to indefinitely. The historical case that best matches what South Texas is now experiencing is the southwestern megadrought that began around 2000. Research published in 2020 documented it as the second driest period in over 200 years of tree-ring records. That megadrought, still ongoing, drew down the Colorado River system to levels that required federal emergency intervention at Lake Mead and Lake Powell. The mechanism was the same as what's now active in South Texas. Rising temperatures increased evaporative demand faster than precipitation could replace the deficit. Corpus Christi sits at the eastern edge of that same expanding arid zone. Pull up satellite imagery of Lake Mead from 2000 and compare it to the same lake in 2024. The shoreline has receded by miles. White mineral bands on the surrounding rock mark where the water used to sit. Federal water authorities have declared multiple shortage tiers, triggering mandatory cuts to states across the Colorado River Compact. The mechanism that drained Lake Mead is the same mechanism currently active at Choke Canyon. The difference is timing. Lake Mead has been in measurable decline for 24 years. Choke Canyon is roughly 5 years into the same pattern. The current data confirms the mechanism is active in the Nueces Basin right now. Choke Canyon fell from 47% capacity in October 2021 to 8.3% in June 2026. That's a 38 percentage point loss across 4.5 years, recorded in Texas Water Development Board data. Year-to-date rainfall in the coastal bend runs below 60% of normal. NOAA's Southern Plains Drought. Early Warning System Coordinator Joel Lysenby stated in a June 2026 interview that the outlook for the coastal bend this summer is hot and dry. Every data signal currently available is consistent with aridification, not with a drought cycle approaching its end. Kenneth Dees is a water resources engineer based in Fort Worth. He has spent his career working on municipal water systems across Texas. In May 2026, he told the Texas Tribune something that stopped many readers cold. "We've got a large city in a first world country, and it's running out of water." He said it matter-of-factly, the way an engineer describes a structural failure after the inspection. Not alarmed, resigned. That tone is the detail that carries the weight. This is not an environmentalist making a worst-case argument. This is the kind of professional who was paid to keep systems like this running, saying plainly that this one is not being kept running. Engineers do not use language like that until they have exhausted every other way to describe what the data shows. The resignation in his voice is the part that matters most. Engineers are trained to identify problems and then identify solutions to those problems. When an engineer describes a problem without offering a solution in the same breath, the engineer is telling you that the standard solutions don't fit the problem. That's what Dees was saying. Not we have to act fast. Not here is the solution. The city is running out of water, and the tone said the rest. What anthropogenic aridification means for the near-term forecast is specific. The NOAA Climate Prediction Center publishes a monthly drought outlook. The outlook, valid through May 26, 2026, projects that drought will persist and may worsen in the southeastern plains, which includes the coastal bend through the summer months. El Niño is forecast to strengthen through fall 2026 with greater than 95% confidence. The Climate Prediction Center projects a greater than 40% chance of a strong El Niño by August or September. Strong El Niño years historically suppress Atlantic hurricane development. Suppressed hurricane development means reduced Gulf moisture transport. The coastal bend depends on Gulf moisture for late summer rainfall recovery. This summer's forecast is not just a drought forecast. It is a forecast consistent with an aridifying system that is not being moderated by the usual recovery mechanisms. The mid-part tension spike sits exactly here. El Niño suppresses Gulf moisture. Gulf moisture is what the coastal bend needs for late summer recovery. This summer, it is forecast to be suppressed with greater than 95% confidence. Read what that confidence interval actually means. A 95% confidence level in climate forecasting is unusual. Most seasonal forecasts come in at 60 to 70% confidence. When the Climate Prediction Center reports greater than 95% on an El Niño development signal, they are telling you that the underlying oceanic conditions, including sea surface temperatures across the equatorial Pacific, are already so far along the development pathway that reversal in the relevant time frame is essentially excluded. The El Niño is forming. The question is only how strong it gets and how long it lasts. For Corpus Christi, the relevant consequence is the connection between El Niño and the coastal bend's late summer rainfall pattern. Late summer rainfall in South Texas is dominated by two mechanisms. The first is tropical moisture pushed inland by Atlantic systems, including hurricanes and tropical storms. The second is mesoscale convective systems that develop when Gulf moisture interacts with continental air masses. Both depend on warm, moist Gulf air being available at the right time. This summer, both mechanisms face suppression simultaneously. The math compounds in a way that does not favor reservoir recovery. What anthropogenic aridification does not yet tell us is precisely how fast the transition will accelerate in any given location or decade. Climate science can define the direction and the mechanism with high confidence. It cannot give a city a countdown clock that is accurate to the month. The honest uncertainty is this: the Corpus Christi system may have more time than the current data suggests, or less. What it almost certainly does not have is a return to the conditions the reservoirs were built for. Hold that honest uncertainty for a moment. Climate science tells us the direction of this shift with high confidence, but not the precise speed. Corpus Christi may have until December 2026, or the May rainfall relief may be temporary enough that September comes back into range. What the science cannot provide is a single month that will be the turning point. What it can provide is the trajectory, and the trajectory does not end with the reservoirs refilling. There's a useful comparison from medical diagnostics. A cardiologist telling a patient with documented coronary disease that a cardiovascular event is coming cannot name the month or the year. The honest uncertainty doesn't refute the diagnosis. It refines the timeline within a range that still requires action. That is the position Corpus Christi is in. The aridification diagnosis is established. Every decision the city makes from June 2026 onward, including the desalination delay and the state water plan benchmark, is a decision made under that diagnosis. There's one more piece of the aridification framework worth understanding. The mechanism is not a continuous smooth shift. It manifests as repeating drought events that are individually short but collectively cumulative. Each event draws the baseline lower. Each recovery returns the baseline to a slightly lower starting point than the previous one. Over decades, the pattern looks like a staircase descending. From inside any single drought event, the pattern looks like a normal cyclical dry period. The cyclical appearance is what makes the mechanism difficult to act against politically. By the time the staircase pattern is clearly visible in the data, multiple steps have already been taken. For Corpus Christi, the staircase is now visible. Choke Canyon's recovery in 2018 returned it to roughly 95% of capacity after the 2011-2015 drought. Its recovery in 2021, after the 2018-2020 dry period, returned it to roughly 47%. The next recovery event, when it eventually arrives, will almost certainly return the reservoir to less than 47%. The staircase is descending in 20 to 30 percentage point steps every cycle. That's the measurable signature of aridification operating on a regional reservoir system. Look at what this signature means for the December 2026 emergency. The city's official math assumes that a recovery event of some kind, summer rainfall, tropical moisture, autumn precipitation, will eventually bring the system back to functional levels. The aridification framework says the recovery will arrive but will not return the system to the levels the contracted demand requires. The gap between contracted demand and recovered supply is what Corpus Christi has to plan for. That gap is what the desalination plant was meant to fill. That gap is what the June 2 vote postponed. There's a question that almost every viewer is asking at this point in the video. The question is simple. If aridification is real, and if NOAA and PNAS and peer-reviewed researchers have been saying so since 2020, why isn't this the headline in every American newspaper? The answer is not flattering to American media. Aridification is a slow-moving story. Cable news cycles run on events. Aridification is the absence of events sustained over decades. It produces individual droughts and individual reservoir lows that get covered. It does not produce a single moment that anchors a national story. The mechanism is invisible at the speed news operates. There's also a political dimension. Naming aridification publicly invites argument about climate policy. Cities and states often prefer to describe what they're experiencing as a severe drought, rather than as a permanent shift, because severe drought language preserves the political option of waiting for rain. Aridification language requires immediate adaptation investments. The phrasing carries policy implications, and the policy implications carry political costs. That's why almost no one in elected office in Texas, at the state or city level, has used the word aridification in a public statement about Corpus Christi. The word is in the seminars. It is not yet in the press releases. The 1950s drought ended, and the recovery was real enough to rebuild an entire state water system from scratch. Reservoirs refilled, crops returned, the economy rebuilt over a decade. That is the precedent the public consciousness around Texas water carries into every conversation about what is happening right now. The precedent is hopeful. The precedent says, this happened before, it was terrible, we got through it. The aridification framework says, this time is different. Not because the immediate suffering is worse, but because the recovery curve is structurally different. The reservoir, on average, will not return to where it was. That is the part that the historical precedent cannot prepare anyone for. Everything in Part 4 comes from peer-reviewed science and official agency research. But to understand why this mechanism is so difficult to act against, you need to understand the last time Texas faced something close to it and what it cost. Part 5 goes back to the drought that built these reservoirs and shows you what history already proved about what happens when a planning system runs out of road. Part 5. What history proved. Part 4 named the mechanism. Part 5 is where the history catches up to it. The 1950s drought of record is not ancient history for the people living in South Texas today. It is the event that built the infrastructure their lives depend on. It lasted from 1949 through 1957, 7 consecutive years. It killed farms, collapsed rural economies, drove families off land their grandparents had worked, and cost the state $22 billion in 2011 dollars. And it was bad enough that Texas responded by building reservoirs specifically sized to make sure it could never happen again. Those reservoirs are now more empty than the drought they were built to survive. The 1950s Texas drought of record ran 7 years, from 1949 through 1957. The Texas Water Development Board's historical records put the losses at $22 billion in 2011 dollars. At least 1,000 Texas communities enforced water restrictions at some point during those 7 years. Some towns went completely dry. Water had to be shipped in by rail. Corsicana, Texas recorded 82 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in a single year, peaking at 113 degrees. Dallas ran its reservoirs so low that the city pulled water from the Red River whose salt content was high enough to damage pipes and industrial equipment. In the town of Corsicana, Texas, during the summer of 1953, the temperature climbed above 100 degrees for the 50th consecutive day. A farmer named Clarence Boyd had already sold off half his herd because the pasture was dead and he couldn't afford to haul water for all of them. He kept the others alive by driving 40 miles round trip 3 times a week with a water tank in the bed of his truck. His neighbours were doing the same. When the local reservoir finally dropped below the intake pipe, the town sent delegations to Austin to ask the state for emergency help. The state's answer, 4 years later, was the Texas Water Development Board and $200 million in reservoir construction loans. The drought ended eventually, the towns rebuilt, and they built the infrastructure so that it would never come to that again. It is coming to that again. Read that last sentence carefully. It is coming to that again. The infrastructure was built to prevent this. The infrastructure is failing under conditions the infrastructure was designed for. The same kinds of decisions the families in Corsicana made in 1953, sell off half the herd, haul water 40 miles, send a delegation to ask for help, are decisions families in the coastal bend are starting to make today. The setting is different. The shape of the decisions is the same. Texas responded to the 1950s drought by building. The state created the Texas Water Development Board in 1957. A constitutional amendment that same year authorized $200 million in water infrastructure loans. The number of Texas reservoirs more than doubled by 1970. By 1980, more than 126 major reservoirs had been constructed across the state. Texas built Choke Canyon Reservoir and Lake Corpus Christi in this response era. Engineers sized both reservoirs to the conditions of the 1950s drought because that was the worst recorded data they had. The parallel to today is direct. The 1950s crisis created the infrastructure. That infrastructure is now insufficient for the conditions it was built to prevent. Read those 2 sentences one more time. The crisis built the system. The system is failing under the next version of the crisis. That is the lesson the history teaches, and the lesson the current generation of planners has not yet fully absorbed. The scientific evidence confirming that current conditions exceed the 1950s benchmark comes from multiple independent research tracks. The PNAS 2020 paper by Overpeck and Udall documents that aridification in North America is producing conditions outside the range of any instrumental record. That means any measurement taken since modern weather monitoring began. The Texas Water Research Network study, published in Earth's Future and cited at noaesdrought.gov, specifically found that Texas reservoir supplies are projected to decrease throughout the 21st century. The study found that climate models project conditions in the latter half of this century to be drier than any megadrought in the last 1,000 years. These are not worst-case scenarios. The models are producing central projections using best available data, and the Texas State Climatologist's Office has reviewed and endorsed the findings. Look at the words being used in those research findings and notice their weight. Outside the range of any instrumental record, drier than any megadrought in the last 1,000 years. Central projections, not worst case. The language of peer-reviewed climate science is carefully measured. Researchers don't reach for those phrases lightly. They use them when the data leaves no other option. Now read the mid-part tension spike against that backdrop. The 1950s drought was the worst thing ever measured. The science now says what's happening exceeds it, and the plan still uses 1957 as its ceiling. That tension spike is the central finding of Part 5 compressed into 3 sentences. The drought was the worst measured. The current condition exceeds it. The plan still uses the old worst case as the ceiling. Everything else in the planning system flows from those 3 facts, and the gap between them is what every actor downstream of the plan is operating inside. What the combined evidence says about the current trajectory is this. The 1950s drought was a temporary extreme event in a climate system that eventually recovered. The current conditions in South Texas are consistent with a directional shift that does not recover. The reservoirs Texans built in the 1960s and 1970s were designed for a drought that ends. They were not designed for a baseline that permanently moves lower. The gap between those 2 things is where Corpus Christi currently sits. The water was supposed to be there, and for 70 years it was, and now it is not coming back. Each clause adds weight to the one before it. The water was supposed to be there as the original wrongness, and for 70 years it is the verification that the assumption held for an entire generation. and now it is not coming back is the consequence the science has documented. The phrase has expanded from a personal observation in the Hook to a full historical and scientific statement here. The June 30 NOAA monthly drought outlook will either confirm that the summer is delivering enough moisture to hold December, or it will begin a process of updating that timeline backward toward the fall. That release falls on the last day of June 2026. It will reflect 6 full weeks of summer conditions in the coastal bend. If the coastal bend drought has worsened, or if the May rainfall improvement has reversed, the outlook will show persistence or intensification. City planners will then need to reconsider whether December holds. NOAA Southern Plains drought. Early Warning System Coordinator Joel Listenby said directly in June 2026 that the agency is expecting a hot and dry summer along the coastal bend. That statement is the operational forecast. It is not a worst case. It is the central projection. The outlook on June 30th will quantify it. The outlook will say, in percentage probability terms, how likely the drought is to persist, worsen, or improve in each of the affected subregions across Texas. Look at the technical structure of a NOAA monthly drought outlook. The product divides the United States into regions and assigns each region a probability category: persistence, worsening, improvement, new development, removal. Each region gets a single classification for the upcoming month. Corpus Christi's coastal bend will fall into one of those categories on June 30th. The category determines what city planners and state agencies will model against in their next planning cycle. If the category is persistence, December holds tentatively, but on the strength of the eastern supply alone. If the category is worsening, the September date returns to the planning model, and city officials will need to issue a public update. If the category is improvement, the math eases temporarily, but the underlying aridification mechanism remains in place. Improvement at the monthly outlook level is not the same as recovery at the trajectory level. Hold that distinction carefully. A NOAA monthly drought outlook describes the next 30 to 90 days. Aridification describes the next 30 to 90 years. The monthly outlook can show improvement while the long-term trajectory shows continued decline. Corpus Christi planners have to manage both clocks. They cannot let a favourable monthly outlook obscure the longer-term direction. They cannot let the longer-term direction blind them to the monthly tactical reality. Both have to be tracked. The 1950s drought planners did not have access to climate-scale projections. They could only respond to what they had measured. They built reservoirs sized to the past because they had no defensible projection of a different future. The current generation of planners has access to climate-scale projections. They are choosing whether to incorporate them. That's the difference. The 1950s response was constrained by limited science. The 2026 response is constrained by political and institutional inertia. Different constraint, different excuse, similar outcome unless the constraint is removed. Pull up Corsicana, Texas in 1953 once more. The temperature broke 100 degrees for 50 consecutive days. The pasture turned to dust. Cattle died. Families left land their grandparents had bought. The federal government provided some relief. The state government promised more. The drought continued for 4 more years before it ended. When it ended, the survivors built the Texas Water Development Board. They built the reservoirs. They built the system designed to make sure it would never come to that again. It is coming to that again. The reservoirs are emptier than the 1950s left them. The infrastructure is showing the wear of conditions it was not built to handle. The political response is divided, and the science describing the mechanism is in the academic literature but not in the press releases. Every element of the 1950s pattern is repeating, with one difference. The mechanism this time is not a temporary climate excursion. It is a permanent shift. That is what the history proves and what the science extends. The first half of this story already happened in Corsicana in 1953. The infrastructure built in response is failing now. The next response, whatever it is, has to be built against a baseline that the previous response did not have to plan for. There's a piece of the 1950s history that almost never gets discussed and that matters here. During the drought's worst years, Texas saw measurable population shifts. Counties in the western parts of the state lost residents who moved east or out of state entirely. The Dust Bowl pattern, often associated with the 1930s, repeated in attenuated form across rural Texas during the 1950s. Families who had owned land for generations sold it, often at distressed prices, and relocated to cities where water and work were still available. The economic and demographic consequences of the drought extended well beyond the 7 years of the event itself. Read that history against the 2026 question. If aridification continues to draw down water supplies across South Texas, what does the population response look like? Corpus Christi has 318,000 residents. The metropolitan area has more. Some of those residents are connected to land or jobs that cannot be moved. Refinery workers cannot relocate a refinery. Port workers cannot move a port. But other residents, including retirees, service workers, and small business operators, have more mobility. If the water situation continues to deteriorate, the demographic response is not zero. The 1950s drought ended and the population partially returned. The aridification scenario does not end on the same timeline. If demographic shifts begin now in response to water uncertainty, the return curve that followed the 1950s drought may not be available. People who leave a city that is permanently entering a drier baseline may not return when the rain comes back, because the rain coming back does not by itself reverse the underlying shift. The history proves the mechanism is real and the consequences documented. But none of what parts 1 through 5 have covered answers the question that every viewer watching this is actually asking. Part 6 is where this becomes personal, because this story does not stay in Corpus Christi, and the people who will feel it next may not live anywhere near the Texas coast. Part 6. What it costs everyone. The port of Corpus Christi is the #1 crude oil export port in the United States. Corpus Christi is not a story about one city. It is a story about what happens to a system when one critical node inside it runs dry. Everything that goes into and out of that port depends on water, and not in a small way. Refineries use water for cooling. Without cooling water, refinery operations do not slow down, they shut down, and what shuts down in Corpus Christi does not stay in Corpus Christi. For the 318,000 residents of Corpus Christi, the personal stakes are already being felt. Since August 2024, no one in the city has been allowed to water their lawn. Stage 3 drought restrictions prohibit outdoor irrigation, most garden watering, home vehicle washing, and virtually all non-essential outdoor water use. Violations after the first carry fines up to $2,000. A Level 1 water emergency, projected for December 2026, would require every household to cut consumption to 6,000 gallons per month. The average American household uses approximately 9,000 gallons per month. Every family in Corpus Christi would be legally required to live at 2/3 of what every other American household considers normal for an indefinite period, while the city tries to build infrastructure that takes years to build. Walk through what that 6,000-gallon ceiling means inside an actual household. A typical American shower uses 17 gallons. A typical bath uses 36. A typical dishwasher cycle uses 6. A typical washing machine cycle uses 20. A typical toilet flush uses 1.6. Add those up for a family of 4 across 30 days, and you do not have to be careful to exceed 6,000 gallons. You have to be deliberately, continuously vigilant. Every faucet, every flush, every load of laundry, every shower length. The 6,000-gallon ceiling is not a theoretical limit. It is a sustained behavioral mandate. The industrial stakes reach further. The port of Corpus Christi contributed more than $113 billion to the Texas state economy in 2024, according to Texas Comptroller data. It supports more than 864,000 jobs across the country, including 12,000 directly in the Corpus Christi area. Most of those local jobs pay $120,000 or more annually, which is roughly 3 times the area's median income. Refineries along the port corridor use water for cooling and steam generation. These are not systems that can reduce water intake gradually, the way a household turns off a lawn sprinkler. Cutting water to a refinery abruptly creates equipment failure risks that include industrial accidents. The industry cannot simply comply with a 25% water cut the way a resident can. Refinery cooling systems are continuous. They cannot be partially turned off without damaging the equipment they cool. A water reduction order applied to a refinery the way it would be applied to a household would force the refinery to either shut down a unit entirely or risk failure of that unit's cooling capacity. Consider a woman named Maria, 63 years old, retired, living in a house she's owned for 22 years in a neighborhood 10 miles from the port. She's not an oil worker, she does not have a refinery job, but her neighbor does, and so does her neighbour's son. Her property value is tied to this city's economy. Her water bill has been rising. Her lawn has been dead for 2 years. She cannot wash her car in her driveway. And when she turns on the news, no one is talking about what happens to a retired woman on a fixed income in a city that gets formally declared to be 180 days from its water supply running out. What happens to her house value? What happens to her insurance? What happens to the businesses she shops at when 12,000 high-income workers start making relocation decisions? She's not in any official report. She is who this story is actually about. Maria's calculation is the calculation that runs underneath the official numbers. Property values respond to local economic conditions. Insurance rates respond to risk profiles. If the city's industrial base contracts because of water restrictions, property values soften. If the city's risk profile escalates because of declared emergencies, insurance rates rise. If both happen at once, retired households on fixed incomes absorb the squeeze. The official planning documents do not have a line item for Maria. She is the consequence the line items add up to. The pipeline that runs from Corpus Christi refineries to major Texas cities carries jet fuel. Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio all receive jet fuel through supply lines that originate in Corpus Christi. If refinery output is curtailed because of water restriction, jet fuel supply to those cities tightens. Tight jet fuel supply raises fuel prices. Raised fuel prices affect airline ticket costs, freight costs, and logistics networks across the state. This is not a hypothetical chain. This is how infrastructure interdependence works. South Texas's water system sits at one of the most load-bearing points in that chain. That's the mid-part tension spike. The jet fuel pipeline from Corpus Christi to Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio does not know there is a water crisis in the city where it starts. It will find out when the refineries do. Read that sentence one more time. A pipeline doesn't know anything. A pipeline is steel and pressure and flow. But the system the pipeline feeds is responsive to its inputs. The airlines flying out of DFW don't price tickets based on Corpus Christi reservoir levels. They price tickets based on jet fuel supply contracts. Those contracts are written against refinery output. Refinery output is written against water availability. The chain runs upstream. The endpoints don't see the source. They only see the symptoms when the source fails. 2 scenarios are genuinely possible from here. The first is that NOAA's June 30th drought outlook shows enough moisture signal in the coastal bend to hold the December 2026 emergency date. Mitigation projects including groundwater wells and effluent reuse come online close to schedule. The city reaches a decision on desalination before summer ends. In this scenario, December arrives. A level 1 emergency is declared. Restrictions tighten, but the city and the port continue to function at reduced but sustainable capacity while longer-term solutions are built. The second scenario is that the summer is as hot and dry as NOAA's current signals suggest. May's rainfall relief does not repeat. Lake Texana, which is currently near full but declining, drops below 40% and triggers a 20% curtailment of eastern supplies. The December date moves to September or earlier. In that scenario, the industrial curtailments begin before the alternative infrastructure is operational. The consequences extend beyond Corpus Christi's city limits into the Texas energy economy. Each clause adds weight to the one before it. They built the reservoirs for it. The reservoirs are at 17%. They built the port around it. The port consumes water at industrial scale. They built 22-year retirements and 12,000 careers on the assumption of it. Every layer in the stack carries the same wrong assumption, and now the science says that assumption has expired. The water was supposed to be there, and for 70 years it was, and now it is not coming back. The specific data point that determines which of these scenarios becomes real arrives June 30th, 2026. NOAA releases the next monthly drought outlook on that date. That release will show whether the coastal bend's drought has persisted, worsened, or improved since the last update. It will recalibrate the probability of the December date holding. The city will use that data, along with real-time reservoir readings from the Texas Water Development Board, to determine whether any of the projected mitigation timelines need to be accelerated. June 30 is the next hard moment in this story. Look at the cascade if Scenario 2 unfolds. Lake Texana drops below the 40% threshold. The La Vaca Navidad River Authority implements the contractual 20% curtailment. Corpus Christi's eastern supply, which is currently delivering 65% of daily demand, drops to 52%. The western reservoir, still at 17% combined, cannot absorb the additional load. The Level 1 emergency date moves forward. Industrial users get notified of mandatory cuts. Refineries begin scheduling unit shutdowns. The first refinery unit to come offline doesn't have to be the largest one, it just has to be the one whose cooling water margin compresses fastest. The system finds its weakest link, and the cascade begins there. That's not a worst-case scenario in the sense of low probability tail risk. It's the scenario the current data signals are consistent with. The 95% confidence El Niño forecast, the below 60% rainfall year-to-date, the hot and dry summer forecast from the NOAA coordinator on record. None of those are worst-case assumptions, they are the central projections. A Corpus Christi refinery slowdown reduces national crude oil export capacity. Crude oil pricing is set at the margin, which means even a partial reduction at the country's largest export point moves prices. This is not a regional story. It is a national infrastructure story with international price implications, and most of the people it will reach have never thought about a Texas reservoir. The jet fuel pipeline reaches them. The oil export market reaches them. The insurance and reinsurance markets that price climate risk into property values reach them. Maria, 63 years old, 10 miles from the port, is one version of how the consequences land. There are millions of Marias in cities that have never heard of Choke Canyon. The grain moving through the Texas Gulf Coast feeds export markets in China, Mexico, and Egypt. Fertilizer for that grain comes in part from petrochemical facilities, along the same corridor that depends on Corpus Christi water. If refinery curtailment ripples into petrochemical curtailment, fertilizer supply tightens, grain production responds, and export prices follow. A water crisis in one Texas city translates, through several intermediate steps, into food prices in countries that have no idea where the Nueces Basin is. Each layer in this chain assumed the water would be available. The aridification framework says that assumption has expired. Hold that picture. A single water-constrained refinery shutdown in Corpus Christi reaches into airline pricing in Texas, oil markets globally, fertilizer markets, grain markets, and ultimately food prices in countries that have no idea where the Texas coastal bend is. That is what infrastructure interdependence in 2026 looks like. That is what the 8.3% reading at Choke Canyon ultimately points toward if the trajectory the data describes plays out the way the science suggests. Most of the time, this kind of cascade does not happen. Systems have buffers. Refineries have backup water sources. Cities can declare emergencies and pull from alternative supplies. Markets absorb shocks. The question Corpus Christi is asking on June 3, 2026, is whether the buffers are still sufficient to absorb the next shock. The data says the buffers have already been drawn down. The historical record says recovery follows drought. The science says aridification does not, in the relevant sense, recover. The combination of those three statements is what makes this story different from previous regional water stories. The buffers are lower than usual, the recovery curve is different than usual, the interdependence is wider than usual, and the June 30 data release will tell us whether the trajectory inside this scenario is bending closer to outcome 1 or outcome 2. That release is 26 days from tonight. There's a final piece of the cost calculation that deserves attention. The Federal Disaster Response System, which exists to support American cities in crisis, has historically been organized around discrete events: hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, wildfires, earthquakes. Each of these has a clearly identifiable start and end. Federal aid flows in response to the event. Aridification does not have a discrete event. It has a sustained, slow-moving trajectory that does not trigger the same emergency declarations as a hurricane landfall. Cities under aridification stress are partially invisible to a federal aid system designed for fast-moving disasters. That invisibility is a cost the official documents do not measure, but that Corpus Christi residents will encounter the first time they apply for federal water infrastructure aid against a non-event timeline. The specific data point that updates this story is the NOAA Climate Prediction Center Monthly Drought Outlook, releasing June 30th, 2026. That is 26 days from tonight. What it shows will either hold the December emergency date or begin moving it. Here is why June 30th matters specifically. The May rainfall that pushed the emergency date from September to December was real. It was enough to raise reservoir levels slightly and give the city's mitigation projects a few more weeks of runway. But May rainfall in South Texas is not summer rainfall. June, July, and August in the coastal bend are the months NOAA is calling hot and dry with strong El Niño conditions, suppressing Gulf moisture recovery. The May improvement may not survive the summer it walked into. If the June 30th outlook shows drought persistence or worsening in the coastal bend, city planners will need to recalibrate. Lake Texana, which is currently near full and carrying a substantial share of the city's water, has a trigger threshold. If it falls below 40%, the Lavaca-Navidad River Authority is required to implement a 20% curtailment. That curtailment would remove the eastern safety net currently holding December in place. What you will miss if you're not here on June 30th is the first data point that tells us whether December is real or whether this story has already moved. This is not a story that ends, it is a story that updates, and the next update is 26 days away. Subscribe to Rupture because the June 30th NOAA drought outlook for the coastal bend is the next hard number in this story, and we will have it analysed and on screen the same day it releases. If the emergency date moves, you will know before most people do. If it holds, you will know that too and understand what it took to hold it. If this video changed how you think about water infrastructure in the United States, leave a comment below. The question we want to hear from you is this. Do you think a city with the country's largest oil export port should have run this close to a water emergency before any of the solutions were shovel-ready? On June 30th, NOAA releases the next drought outlook for the coastal bend. That number either moves the emergency closer or confirms it holds. Either way, this city does not have the water it was promised, and the question nobody in any official document is answering is whether it ever will again. Look at what 26 days actually contains. 6 full weeks of summer weather data, daily reservoir readings published by the Texas Water Development Board, available to anyone who wants to track them, soil moisture readings from agricultural monitoring stations across the coastal bend, streamflow data from the United States Geological Survey, gauging stations along the Nueces River and its tributaries, Lake Texana level, reports from the Lavaca-Navidad River Authority. Each of these data streams will update through the month, and the cumulative picture they paint will be the picture NOAA's June 30th outlook draws on when it issues the next probability assessment for the region. None of these streams is a secret. All of them are public. Watching them is how you know what June 30 will say before NOAA says it. There's a specific pattern to watch for. If the daily reservoir readings at Choke Canyon trend flat or slightly upward through June, the outlook is likely to assign a higher probability to improvement or persistence. If the daily readings continue to descend, at the rate they've descended since 2021, the outlook is likely to assign a higher probability to worsening. The pattern is already readable. If Lake Texana drops below 80% before the end of June, the eastern supply margin compresses faster than the model projects. That is the single most important readable signal in the next 26 days, and it doesn't require a NOAA release to track. It requires reading a public dashboard. If you are watching this in Corpus Christi, the practical question is what to monitor in your own household between now and December. The answer is your monthly water consumption, in gallons, as reported on your bill. The 6,000 gallon threshold is what the Level 1 emergency will require. Households that are already operating near that threshold will absorb the emergency more easily. Households that are not will face a sudden behavioural adjustment when the emergency declares. If you're watching this anywhere else in the United States, the practical question is whether your local water system has performed its own version of the analysis the State Water Plan has not yet performed. The aridification framework does not apply only to Corpus Christi. It applies to every city in the expanding arid zone of North America. The pattern visible at Choke Canyon is the pattern that will, in different forms and on different timelines, become visible elsewhere.